Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum. I'm Tom Schwartz, the director, and I thank you for joining us to remember all who served the call of their country in this Veterans Day program. This program, and many like it, are made possible by the Hoover Presidential Foundation. If you're not a member, I hope you'll pick up a membership brochure at the front desk and consider joining. At this time, please silence all electronic devices, and there'll be an opportunity to purchase books by the author following the talk. Tim Plekovich is an author as well as a man of many talents. He spent 25 years in the classroom as a secondary school teacher in New York and Illinois. He also served as a baseball scout for the Chicago Cubs and later as an in-studio analyst covering the Boston Red Sox for WAET Radio in Marshfield, Massachusetts. In a series of interviews with World War II veterans, Plekovich learned that many were sons of fathers who had fought in the Civil War 80 years earlier, which became the basis for his first book and the subject of today's talk. Most of us would not connect the two since they are so distant in time from one another. Here to provide all the fascinating details of these lives is Tim Plekovich.
Lynn, is that good?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Tom, actually, we can even go a step further than that as far as making the connection between the Civil War fathers and the sons and daughters who served in World War II. We actually found one gentleman whose dad served with an Ohio regiment during the Civil War, who was a fighter pilot in Vietnam. So in that case, we're looking at two generations fighting in wars 100 years apart. I noticed somebody in the audience is from Wisconsin, right? Or maybe not in the theater. Okay, I noticed there was a Wisconsin license plate in the car, because the book has a very big Midwestern, especially Wisconsin connection. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later on, but I just wanted to introduce it to you also right at the beginning. As you can imagine, there probably were some people who were pretty skeptical about this and thinking, how could it possibly be that you could have people alive today whose dads fought in the Civil War? And yeah, you're kind of nodding, thinking, my gosh, how could that be? So one of the graphic arts people with the publishing company who did the book for us contacted me one day and he said, you know, Tim, you might have a little bit of a dilemma with this, trying to really convince those people who might be doubters. So he said, for the cover jacket of the book, why don't we try and find the father-son combination with the most striking resemblance? So they ended up using this gentleman who was a Wisconsin vet. Some of you who might be Civil War aficionados have heard of the 2nd Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry. It was the first 3-year regiment to be formed in the United States, very, very early in the embryonic stages of the war. It became part of a brigade which was known as the Iron Brigade or the Black Hat Brigade. And they were in all the major battles the first 2.5 years of the war. They ended up being decimated at Gettysburg, and they did, for all intents and purposes, did not exist after Gettysburg. But this gentleman was one of the early members of the 2nd Wisconsin Volunteers. He's pictured in 1862. This is his youngest son, who is pictured in his Army Air Corps uniform in 1942. Has anyone figured out yet how this could be? Anyone with any ideas? Yes, ma'am.
Young wives.
Well, yeah, they were young wives, but there was another part of it which was even more important.
Long life.
Long lives by whom, Lynn?
The men.
The men, absolutely. In this gentleman's case, this William Upham, the one who served with the 2nd Wisconsin Volunteers and who became governor of Wisconsin after the Civil War, did not become a father biologically until he was 75 years old. His first wife could not have children. She expired in 1912, and at the time he was 71. 2 years after that, he remarried in 1914 at the age of 73. He and his wife didn't want to rush into anything, so they waited 2 years. before Will Jr. was born in 1916. And then 5 years after that, because, once again, you'd like to spread your children a little bit. You don't want to have them all together. 5 years after that, this gentleman, Fritz, was born in 1921. So Dad is pictured here in 1862 in his Army Cadet uniform at the age of 21. Fritz is pictured here in his Army Cadet uniform, in his Army Air Corps uniform in 1942, also at age 21. So that means Dad was born in 1841, and the son was born in 1921. And at the conclusion of the program, National Geographic was nice enough to do a video on the book a couple of years ago. And we're going to watch this video clip in which Fritz talks about his dad's first meeting with President Lincoln. That was how he made it to West Point. His dad had multiple visits with Lincoln during the war. And he's going to talk about his dad's first. Isn't that amazing to think somebody was alive a few months ago to have a video made by National Geographic, somebody whose dad knew President Lincoln. But this gets even crazier, because after the Civil War, after he graduated from the academy in 1866, of course, you have to serve your obligatory 4 years in the American Army. Well, after already having met Lincoln on multiple occasions, he gets assigned to a place called Fort Monroe, Virginia, where, who was Lincoln's counterpart in the war? Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis, man, was being interned at this Fort Monroe in Virginia. Guess who served guard duty on 12-hour shifts for a 6-month period over Jefferson Davis? Will Upham. So not only did he know President Lincoln, he came to know Jefferson Davis intimately. And it just amazes me when you think, Tom, maybe you could give me a figure for this. How many children were sired? How many children were fathered by Union veterans? Or we could just say by Civil War veterans. You think about all the millions who would have been sired by them. And the fact that out of the few who are still living, because there aren't many now, probably about a dozen, maybe to a dozen and a half tops. Out of these who are remaining, one would be someone whose dad knew both President Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. I think the odds of that are phenomenal. Let me tell you a little bit about how this project started, because it all was a very serendipitous occurrence. I used to be a middle school teacher in Peoria, Illinois, and I used to belong to an organization called Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War. And some of you might remember, I don't think anyone here would be old enough, but some of you are going to know about the organization largely to which so many of the Union veterans belonged after the Civil War. And that organization was called the Grand Army of the Republic. It was a fraternal order to which they belonged. There were other fraternal orders to which the Union veterans would belong too. There was one, for instance, called Union Veterans Legion, another one, Union Veterans League, another one, Union Veterans Union, and their purpose, this was multi-purpose, the reason for having these organizations. One, as you can imagine, not having any programs, Lynn, that would have been available at that time for returning veterans, the way that we do now, because these guys had to assimilate back into society pretty quickly too. That was a difficult thing, not having any programs available for them. So it was very important for them to be able to meet with their old comrades from the Civil War on either a weekly basis or at least on a twice-monthly basis. And this is what these fraternal orders provided. The organization was also very, very strong, especially at the beginning, in helping to secure pensions for these different veterans who had served in the Union Army. And this might shock you to find this out. 80%, 4/5 of all Union veterans ended up becoming pensioners. In those cases, for those who had died, their families became the recipients of their pension monies. But just think about that. There were over 2 million Union veterans, serving in the Civil War. And to think that 80% of them, so we're looking at more than 1.5 million, maybe 1.6 million, maybe more than that, people who are the recipients of these pension monies in the years after the Civil War. So the Grand Army of the Republic played a very, very instrumental role in helping these folks to secure these pensions. Everyone in the book, there are 8 families in the book, all 8 Union veterans were all pensioners. Now, you might be thinking too, well, how could that be that 80% of the people who served in the Union Army became sick or were injured, during the war? And my answer to that would be, there was some pension fraud that went on. There's no question about that. But these pensions also just proved to be invaluable. Especially, I was just thinking about one of the families in the book, Tom, a gentleman who was from, after the war, he resided in northwest Arkansas in the Ozarks. This gentleman fathered 5 children after the age of 71. The youngest whom he sired when he was 82. And this gentleman had lost a leg as a result of the war. And so he was receiving a full disability pension in 1930. He lived until 1933. So that pension was very, very important. When he expired in 1933, the pension monies didn't stop, because of course they ended up going to his minors, those children whom he had fathered. And they received the pension benefits until they reached the age of 16. And then when they were 16, the pension monies were cut off. The government passed federal legislation at some point early in the 20th century, because as you can imagine, this was becoming a little enticing to some of the women who were indigent to think, if I can marry an old Civil War vet, I will at least be provided a pension, because there was no Social Security at that time. This was the forerunner to Social Security. And so in this veteran's case, for this woman, she was 27 at the time that they married. He was 71. And so, of course, when he expired, the children became the beneficiaries of the pension monies. She could not collect on her pension monies until she reached the age of 60. And that was what the government stipulated in hopes that this would deter young women from marrying these older men. What is so neat about this story, though, this particular woman, this Mrs. Poole, lived until 1990. She was the last Civil War widow living in Missouri at the time. So she still collected on her pension money for almost 42 years. So she made out pretty well. But anyway, I mentioned that I used to belong to an organization called Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War. And that this organization carried on the torch after the last member of the Grand Army of the Republic succumbed. And that would have been back in 1956. I was giving a presentation over in Galesburg, Illinois, not too long ago, and when I mentioned this last Union veteran passing away in 1956, this gentleman raised his hand and he goes, I met that gentleman. He said, his name was Albert Wilson. And I said, well, that's right. I said, how did you know about it? And he said, well, Mr. Wilson was from the Duluth Superior area where I came from, and he said, every year at the beginning of the winter season, and he said this would have been the day after Thanksgiving, so what today we would call Black Friday. There was a huge carnival that would take place in the Duluth Superior area every year. And they would have a parade replete with all the local dignitaries and the state dignitaries coming by, waving, sitting on the floats. And he said, that's how I got to see Mr. Wilson. And then he said, then he kind of backtracked and he said, well, I didn't get to see him real well. And I said, well, wait a minute, you just told me you saw him. So explain this to me. And he said, well, here's the deal. He said, when I saw Mr. Wilson, it was about 1953. And he said at that time, Mr. Wilson was 103 years old. And he said, I was about 7. And he said, everyone was concerned that he would catch cold. So he said they put him in about 5 or 6 layers of coats of all this clothing. And then they said on top of that, they put a ski mask over his head, so all you could see were his eyes and his mouth. And he had so much clothing on, he couldn't move his arm, and it was just going back and forth just about an inch, and that was it. So he said, that was my experience seeing Albert Wilson. When I was telling that, I got a rise out of somebody just a couple weeks after that, raised his hand, and he said, Tim, I have something funny to tell you. He said, I have an Albert Wilson story also. He said, although I didn't meet the man. But he said, you'll like this. He said, I'm 89 years old. He said, I was born in 1930. And he said, I'm a Korean veteran. And he said, I was very musically inclined. And he said, when I entered the Army, after graduating from college in 1952, I became part of the American Army Band. And And he said, so here's my Albert Wilson story. He said in early 1953, when Dwight Eisenhower, of course, became our new president, succeeding Harry Truman, he said he decided that he wanted to always keep a very good portion of the American Army band in the States, because he said several of us were going over to South Korea to entertain the troops. And he said the reason they wanted to keep a sizable portion of us in the States was because whenever Albert Wilson expired, and he was now 103 years old, they wanted to be able to bury him at Arlington National Cemetery, replete with all the honors that should be accorded to him as the last Union veteran. So he said, that kept me back in the States. And he said, well, he said, we got through 1953, and I'm still in the service. Albert Wilson hasn't died. He said, we get through 1954, I'm still in the service. Albert Wilson hasn't died. He said, we get through 1955, he said, now my hitch is up, Albert Wilson is still alive. So he said, he kept me out of harm's way that whole time. Well, anyway, I said a couple of times that I used to belong to this Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War. The organization was having its national encampment in Springfield, Illinois a few years ago. And since I live in Peoria, I thought it would be a good move to go to one of the national encampments, since this one was in such close proximity to where I live. And so I went down with a few other folks from Peoria. And in one of these dreadfully boring business meetings at the outset of the convention, a gentleman stood up and he was introduced, a gentleman by the name of Ed Blakely from Grand Rapids, Michigan. Ed was introduced as the son of a Michigan cavalry soldier. Well, right away, I'm thinking in my mind, because I was a teacher, and this is the end of summer, it's like the first weekend in August, and I'm thinking to myself, wouldn't it be neat for one of my middle school students to correspond with this Mr. Blakely, because I was going to be moving on with these kids to 8th grade, and I had them in 7th grade teaching language arts to them. So I already knew, a lot of my students whom I was going to have. And so I couldn't wait for there to be a break in the meeting. And so I came over to Mr. Blakely once there was a break, and I stuck my hand out, and sir, you don't have a cane. Like, I do have a cane, ma'am. If I could use your cane for just a second. Mr. Blakely was pre-99, and he had a cane just like this. But there was no, believe me folks, there was no need for that cane. Mr. Blakely looked as if tops, maybe late 80s, that was all. And he was in terrific constitution, both physically and then later we're going to learn cerebrally as well. Anyway, he flipped the cane at me like this, and it had his address on the top of it, and he goes, there you go, kid. He said, do with the address what you like. So I said, well, I have one of my middle school students who would love to correspond with you. And so I said, would you be able to write to him if he were to write to you this next week? He said, no problem at all. Well, I was telling some of the guys in the Illinois contingent about meeting with this Mr. Blakely, Tom, and they couldn't believe it. They thought I was embellishing this, in what good shape he was in. And so anyway, so that night, before the dinner, I see Mr. Blakely with some of his Michigan contemporaries. They're over at the bar area before they go into the dining room, and they're singing, and very jolly, they're singing these Union veteran songs like Boys Will Rally Round the Flag, And this gentleman, this pre-99-year-old, has a highball in one hand, he has his cane in the other, which he doesn't need, and he's out on the dance floor just doing all these moves. So as soon as I got back to school, back to Peoria, and now we're still about 3 weeks away from the commencement of the school year, I'm thinking to myself, even though this Mr. Blakely looks great, and he was in great shape, nevertheless, he was going to be 99. So time was not our friend. So I contacted one of my former students, and he knew I was going to have him again later in a couple of weeks. And he said, Mr. Pluck, what are you bothering me for now? He said, I'm going to see you in 3 weeks. I said, Kwame, I said, you can't believe someone whom I met over the weekend. I said, his dad was a Michigan cavalry soldier in the Civil War. Now, if you said that, Lynn, if you said that to most people today, I don't care if it's a young person or an older person, if you said that, it's not going to resonate with them. It's not going to mean anything. But this Kwame was a really, really sharp kid. And he had a real appreciation for history. So he knew that this was very, very unusual. This was a real anomaly. But he was very skeptical. He couldn't believe it. And I could hear him on the other end of the phone he wasn't saying anything into the receiver, but he was doing something numerically, and he was going, 1865, 2000. He goes, no, he goes, Mr. Pletkovich, you didn't meet anybody whose dad fought in the Civil War. So I explained to him how it was. I said, Kwame, I want you to meet me over at school. I said, we're going to write to this guy. And I said, you're going to compose the letter, and then we're going to think up together about 25 or 30 questions we're going to ask him, because I said he was very nice. He's looking forward to hearing from us, so we're going to do this right away. So the next day, Kwame met me over at school. And he composed the letter, and after about 16 tries, it was grammatically correct, and so we were able to send it off. And Kwame said, he said, well, Mr. Pletkovich, you helped me with some of the questions. Well, I helped him with like 2, and then he came up with the next 23. He did a great job. We heard from Mr. Blakely within 8 or 10 days. And Kwame called me up, and he said, you'll never guess who I heard from. And I said, Mr. Blakely. He said, yeah. And he said, now I've got all these questions I really want to ask, because he answered the 25, and now I've got about 50 questions that I want to ask him. So I said, well, you go ahead, Kwame. You write out the question, your new questionnaire, send it off to Mr. Blakely. We'll see what happens. Another 10 days passed. Mr. Blakely wrote a 3rd letter back. So he and Kwame are really going with this. They're really running with it. Now we're ready for the commencement of the school year. And I got to thinking, if this is going this well for Kwame, maybe, just maybe, we could do this as a group assignment in one of my English classes if we could find enough what they are called real sons of Union veterans. Well, the organization, Sons of Union Veterans, was able to supply me with a list of about 30 names. A little bit more than that, actually, about 35. However, as you can imagine, the attrition rate on that list was pretty high, because these folks, at this time when we were doing the project, the children ranged anywhere from being late septuagenarians to being octogenarians. So a lot of them were quite old. But we went ahead, each student had someone whom he could write to. And it went really, really well, because even in the 4 or 5 cases where the son had expired, we heard from either the widow or we heard from one of his children or grandchildren. So we had just 100% as far as the volume that we received from these folks. Letters were so interesting. Some couldn't write a lot because of age, because of infirmity, but others just did a terrific job and gave us more than we could have ever hoped for. Well, I thought this was going to be the end of the project. And then all of a sudden one day in this 7th hour class, last class of the day, about 6 kids stayed after class, 4 of whom were girls. And I mentioned that they were girls, and I'll explain that why in a little bit. And one of them initiated the conversation and said, Mr. Pletkovich said, we know we can't keep doing this in class, writing to these folks, but would you care if we continued to correspond with these folks for a while? And I said, care? I said, that would be great. I said, that's something I hadn't thought you'd be interested in doing, but that's wonderful. So, on a regular basis, for 4 out of the 5 nights a week, from Monday to Thursday, these kids started staying anywhere from 2 to 3.5, 4 hours after school, working on these letters. And it ended up being a composition of about 10 or 12 kids who would stay every night. Well, the 30 surviving real sons gave us the addresses of their sisters, the real daughters. And so that increased our pool from about 30 to 60. Wow. So for these 12 kids, on average, each kid was corresponding with approximately 5, in some cases 6, of these Civil War children. And it was working out very, very well, except I have to tell you this, because you'll get a kick out of this. One gentleman in particular, a gentleman named John Whitman, his dad was a Pennsylvania cavalry soldier during the war, and after the war, Private Whitman became Reverend Whitman, became a Lutheran minister, and he had ministerial assignments in the Midwest, among other places, some of those assignments in the Midwest which weren't too far from here. And anyway, John became a school administrator, the son. And so he was one of the younger folks. He was just in his 80s. And John said to us one day, finally, this Nick Brown, with whom he was corresponding, he said, Nick, he said, I look forward to this, getting a letter from you every week. I think it is wonderful. But kid, don't you know how to do email? And so the Civil War children were all set on doing email, so we had to transition to doing that for them. And it was wonderful. A lot of the kids started to get a commonality though after maybe 4 or 5 letters, and 6 letters, 7 letters, and that was, especially the men, started to say to them, I think I've given you as many memories as I can supply concerning my dad's career. You know, you have to remember I was only 12 or 14 years old when he expired, so I've told you pretty much all that I can. And I said, that's okay. I said, you keep in touch with them, you keep writing to them, because you know how that is with folks. They won't think of something one day, a week from now, a month from now, 2 months from now, they will. So you keep a steady flow of letters going between the two of you. They did. They kept a great job of it. In the meantime, I'm starting to focus on another aspect of this, because, as I say, there was this commonality that we started to see in the letter writing with these folks, especially the men, where they would say, I guess I've given you all the memories I can about my dad's military career. I'll have to be content with my own war memories. Well, that's when it hit me, and it made sense. Most of the folks that we were speaking with were born within a 5-6 year period of 1920, you know, going either way. So, of course, they were World War II veterans. So I started concentrating on that, while the kids continued to and did a great job of extrapolating as much additional information concerning these folks' fathers' Civil War lives as they could. My principal called me down to the office one day. He said, Pleck, I know what you're doing with these kids. And he said, this is really neat. He said, how come you didn't tell me about it? And I said, I didn't have time, because they want to keep working all the time, so I didn't have time after school. And he said, I think we need to try to get them some publicity. Now, this was in a section of Peoria known as the South Side, which is a pretty tough neighborhood. And as my principal, who was a wonderful gentleman, former professional football player, who came back to Peoria after growing up on the South End, came back to be a teacher and coach, and later a principal for us. Just a dynamic leader, a wonderful person to serve as a role model for these students, many of whom were parentless. And he said, you know, Tim, these kids' families get their names in the papers for all the wrong reasons. He said, these kids are doing something really, really special. Yeah. And he said, we need to get them some attention. And so he said, I'm going to call the local paper. So he contacted the local paper. They had a reporter come out, and she did a great job of, you know, having all types of quotations from the kids and how this project developed, what was happening, the story behind the story with so many of these Civil War children and their fathers. Just a terrific job. Well, that article went out over the AP wire. So it was picked up around the country in a lot of the major dailies and in, you know, small town papers, you know, whatever. And so, for instance, the Chicago Trib picked it up and ran a story. The Washington Times ran a feature story. The Wall Street Journal used portions of the interview for a story, which they reprinted. Then we started to hear from some of these different major dailies. A gentleman with the Chicago Trib, who was a longtime reporter, worked in many different capacities for the Trib. He was in the sports department. He wrote a government column. A gentleman by the name of Mike Conklin. Mike contacted us because he wanted to do his own story for the Trib and find out about the kids. This Martha Bolts from the Washington Times contacted us. She had a Civil War column which appeared on a regular basis in the Washington Times. Well, she contacted us, wanted to do a story on the kids. A reporter for the named Jeff Zaslow from the Wall Street Journal contacted us. He ended up using interviews with the kids for 2 other stories for a larger piece on the war experience at whole. And so now we've had these major dailies who have made contact with the students. This thing is really rolling. One day right after that, after one of the articles, or after actually all the articles that appeared because they came out about the same time, my principal called me down to the office and he said, you have a phone call from a gentleman in Nashville. And so this gentleman on the other end introduced himself. And he said, I'm with a publishing company here in Nashville called Cumberland Press. And he said, I was really intrigued by this. He said, we get the Wall Street Journal. And he said, I saw Jeff Zaslow's 2 articles where your students were quoted. And he said, I was just wondering, have you ever considered, do you have enough for book material? And I said, you know, I really hadn't thought about it because we're still in, you know, the fairly early stages of this. We've only been doing it for about 3 or 4 months. And so I said, no, I really haven't given a lot of thought to it. He said, keep us in mind, because he said, this is really unique. Not just the fact that these are children of Civil War soldiers who are still living, but the fact that these children were World War II veterans, both men and women. The very next day, Mr. Lobdell calls me down to the office, and he says, you get another call. And it was a gentleman with a publishing company in St. Petersburg, Florida. He introduced himself, and it was actually the publisher himself who was calling this time. And he said, Tim, he said, we used to have an office in Northern Virginia for Vandermeer Press, and he said, so I still get the Washington Post and the Washington Times. And he said, I was reading Martha Boltz's column the other day about your students. And he said, this is really, really fascinating. He said, this would be great fodder for a book. He said, have you ever thought about this becoming a book? And I said, yeah, I thought about it yesterday. And so he said, well, why don't you plan on coming to Chicago? He said, in the spring. He said, in early June, I said, I'm going to be at the McCormick Place for the American Library Association National Conference. And he said, I'd like to speak with you. I swear, everybody that think from out of state, from out of the Midwest, when you tell them that you're from Illinois, they think you automatically live in Chicago or in one of the Chicago suburbs. Right. So he was a little surprised, I think, that it took me 3.5 hours to get there. But we talked about a potential contract, and a few months later, the contract was consummated with this Vandermeer Press. The book is it's into its third print now. It initially sold 6,000 copies, and I had no idea that it would continue. And it's in its third print now and continuing to do very, very well. I mentioned before that we were so lucky to have such unique experiences amongst these 8 Civil War veterans who are featured in the book, and amongst the 14 World War II veterans who are in the book. I alluded to the fact of having this big Wisconsin connection with this gentleman who served with the 2nd Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry, who ended up later on becoming the governor of Wisconsin. He was injured. Will Upham was 19 years old when he enlisted in the Union Army. He was the youngest of 8 children. And Tom, this is the family I was talking about researching at the Wisconsin Historical Society. And you think about, this is another way that we lucked out. 3 of the 8 Civil War vets in the book had kept diaries. And this gentleman was so meticulous, and actually after he became a Confederate POW, he continued to correspond. And some of his letters were able to get out of Libby Prison in Richmond, Virginia. But anyway, it was decided among, and he's not fabricating this. It really was decided this way. He was the youngest of 8 children. The father was deceased, and it was decided among his 7 older siblings that Will, the youngest, was going to be the family representative in enlisting with the 2nd Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry. So the 2nd Wisconsin immediately goes out east. They trained in Madison and proceeded to go out east, and they fight in the first major battle of the war, which is at Bull Run. Oh shoot! I was going to read an excerpt from one of those letters. He was in a battle the day before Bull Run, which was at Centerville, Virginia. I was going to read that, Tom. We don't need, if you could, Tom. It'll be out there on the table. And so he's writing about his war experiences on this July 20th, and he's talking about the next day, or the day after, is going to be a very, very big battle. And that ended up being Manassas, or the battle at Bull Run. Well, anyway, he is listed as injured at first at the Battle of Bull Run. He had been taken to a makeshift hospital, had a terrible wound. Tom, actually, it's that binder.
The white binder?
Yeah, the white binder. Yeah. He had a terrible wound, which went through his neck, went through his chest, and he was taken to a makeshift hospital nearby in a place called Sidley, Virginia. Well, as you know, that battle was a rout for the Confederacy. And so there were a multiplicity of Union soldiers who had been injured who were at this makeshift hospital, which was this church. And it was very, very sad because the surgeon They did have a surgeon from the 2nd Wisconsin who was there. Thank you, Tom. There was a surgeon from the 2nd Wisconsin who was there, and so that was good. But soldiers who had not been injured but who had helped to have taken them on litters had to leave them at the church. Otherwise, they would have been captured. So they end up, so the ones who are able to move leave, and then the injured become prisoners of the Confederate government. Well, as I mentioned, he has this gaping hole in his neck. He's torn up pretty badly. No vital organs, though, were touched, which is good. He ended up not receiving any medical treatment for the first 3 days. So you can imagine what he must have looked like at the conclusion of that 3 days. I just wanted to read to you an excerpt from a letter that he wrote back to his family the day before the battle at Bull Run. And he says in this letter, and I'll just read this part of it, "We have advanced within 7 miles of Manassas Junction. Day before yesterday, we had quite a severe action near Bull Run. Our troops were repulsed with the loss of 16 killed and 35 wounded. We had been encamped until last Tuesday at Camp Peck, 5 miles from Washington on the Virginia side of the Potomac. We defiled to the right into the woods. When we halted, we expected to be called up to support Sherman's battery. There we lay for more than an hour, cannonballs whistling and crashing through the trees above. You could see one coming, and the boys would duck their heads as it passed over. General McDowell said our regiment formed in the best order of any regiment, and for green hands, see, this is their first battle, and for green hands to stand and have the balls come as close as they did, not knowing but what your head would fly off in a minute, I think we did pretty well. This battery is a very strong one and will have to be bombarded before it can be taken. We are waiting for heavy guns to come up from Washington. We will probably be in battle tomorrow." And then he was injured in the Battle of Bull Run. He's taken to this makeshift field hospital, does not receive any attention for the first 3 days. Eventually, he does receive some attention, and he, along with the other injured soldiers, are transported by the Confederates to Libby Prison in Richmond. Now, for those of you who know a lot about the Civil War, you know that Richmond was the place eventually where the only Union soldiers who would have been there would have been those who were commissioned officers. But at this time, in the early stages of the war, they were putting everyone into this particular locale. So he ends up being interned then at Libby Prison for several months. However, his captain from his company, who had seen him at the church and saw the condition that he was in and the fact that no one was tending to him, he was certain that Will was going to die. So he wrote a letter, 2 letters, back to the family. And he said in these letters, "I have written to you once full particulars concerning the death of Willie." He said, "In my opinion, he is in fact dead. Although when he was left at the hospital, he was still alive. I stood close to him when he was struck and saw plainly how it was. The ball struck him at the left shoulder, passing through the strap, supporting the cartridge box, passing through diagonally, and coming out at the back. It was, I am fearful, a mortal wound." So the family has received word that Will has died at the Battle of Bull Run. The family proceeds to have a funeral service for Will back in Racine, Wisconsin. At that time, Will was engaged to be married to this young woman named Mary Kelly. And so you can imagine the heartache that not only his mother and his siblings are going through, but also for Mary. So the family went ahead with this funeral service. Just a short time after that, the captain writes a 3rd letter back to Mrs. Upham, the mother, stating, "I was sorry that we gave you fallacious information. Will is in fact alive. He is being interned by the Confederates at Libby Prison in Richmond. We will try to keep you informed with information as we go along." Well, actually, Will was able to send a letter out of Libby Prison which reached his family back in Racine. it's interesting, and Tom, you might be able to shed some light on this after looking at that particular letter, because he tried to dispel the thought in his letter that his treatment in the prison was egregious. He was trying to make it sound as if they were being treated very well, as a matter of fact. And I wondered, because when he reached President Lincoln's ear, he gave President Lincoln a different story. And so I'm thinking that maybe as a way to ensure that this letter would get out of the prison, in case it were being censored, that he would have to extend some courtesies to the Confederate government. And so, by the way, he meets Jefferson. I'm not saying that he actually met him. He saw Jefferson Davis at Libby Prison at that time. So anyway, so Captain Strong writes a third letter then to the Upham family. We're sorry we had told you Will had passed away. He is interned at Libby Prison. Well, we get through 1861, and there has not been a release. But there is soon to be a release in January. In early January, 139 of the 140 prisoners at that time at Libby left en masse and were taken to Camp Parole, Maryland, and then from there they went home. I say 139 out of 140. Guess who was the one who didn't go out with that entire group? Yeah, it was Will. So Captain Strong wrote a fourth letter back to the family, this time stating, right, we're sorry we informed you of the death of Will when he was alive. In fact, now we know he did expire between September 15th, 1861 and January 4th, 1862. The very next day, Will is released in this secondary exchange as the last prisoner. When he gets to Camp Parole, Maryland, he's approached by some folks who send him via train to Washington, and he receives word that he is to meet with this United States Wisconsin senator named James Doolittle, who, as serendipity would have it, was from Racine. Now, I don't know if Senator Doolittle had ever met Will Upham, but he was very familiar with the Upham family. And he had been tracking Will's status, where he had been after his incarceration, that kind of thing. So he was aware that Will was thought to have been dead when he was alive, and then dead, then alive. And so, anyway, so when Will gets to D.C., he's met at the train station by Senator Doolittle. Senator Doolittle proceeds to tell him there's somebody who is trying to extract as much information as possible from the recently released prisoners so that we have a better idea of what they're having to endure. You need to come speak with him at the White House. So the three of them then sat down at the White House and had this initial meeting. I won't talk too much about it because in a couple minutes we're going to watch the video presentation where the son, Fritz, tells what transpired between his dad and President Lincoln. Anyway, I will tell you this, and I'll encapsulate this for you so we can get to the video. I'll finish up in the next 5 minutes or so. But anyway, he ends up receiving this appointment to West Point. And so he runs into President Lincoln for a second time then in the spring of 1862. It just so happened while he was there taking his entrance exams, President Lincoln happened to be at the academy also. Lincoln knew that Upham had already passed his entrance examinations. And when he called Upham over, though, he didn't tell him. This sounds, Tom, very Lincoln-esque in Lincoln's humor. And he said, young man, he said, I understand that you've taken your examinations. How did you do on them? And he said, well, Mr. President, I don't know. He said, we just took them yesterday, and he said, we haven't been alerted yet to our status. And Lincoln said something to the effect of, well, I'm sure somebody with faculties as strong as yours are, that you did an adequate job and that you'll be accepted into the academy. So he never did tell him that he had already passed. Well, so he ends up passing. He graduates in the class of 1866, and from there he has to serve the 4 years of Army duty, which would be obligatory for the recently released cadets who are coming out as second lieutenants. And so that's when he's sent to a place called Fort Monroe, Virginia, where Jefferson Davis is being interned. And it's so interesting because Upham develops this, really, it was a strong friendship with Davis during the several-month period during which he had duty covering President Davis on a 12-hour basis, daily basis. They played, just a multiplicity of different games. Played a lot of checkers, a lot of chess. They were both chess players. And so, but you can just play so much chess. And so they would have these in-depth conversations. One of the things that struck Will Upham so interestingly was the fact that Jefferson Davis had such a rich, tremendous knowledge of Wisconsin history, geography, topography, because of course Jefferson Davis had spent many years in Wisconsin, going back to the Black Hawk War, when he was in the American Army and was stationed along the Mississippi at Prairie du Chien. Well, he spent several years at that locale after the war too. And this was something that struck young Upham, just very interesting that here I am, a Wisconsinite, and this guy, this gentleman from the South, the Confederacy president, knew so much more about Wisconsin history than I. And so it really interesting. One of the things that they talked about, and I had talked with Tom a little bit about this earlier, and this is a little dubious, but it was something that Upham wrote about at the time of Jefferson Davis's demise, because he ends up becoming governor of Wisconsin, young Upham, and everyone knows about his connection with both President Lincoln and with Jefferson Davis. One of the things that he and Jefferson Davis talked about was the fact that apparently Jefferson Davis had sired a Menominee Indian during the time that he was stationed at Prairie du Chien along the Mississippi River. And Upham went so far in this, and he wasn't writing it salaciously. He wasn't saying it to be tabloid journalism like something that you'd see in the Daily Mirror or the National Enquirer. That wasn't his purpose for it. He talked as if he knew this son of Jefferson Davis's. And they were approximately the same age. And so he was praising him for the kind of person that he was, both his ability as a businessman and as a person, that he was a great contributor to his community in what turned out to be the neighboring county where Upham lived. Upham lived in Marshfield, Wisconsin, which is in Wood County. It's right smack in the center of the state. Shawano County is in the adjacent county just to the east of Wood County. So it would make perfect sense that he could have, in fact, and as I say, it sounded as if he did know this Menominee Indian son of Jefferson Davis's, who went by two names. One by Joseph Davis, which was interesting because Jefferson Davis had a legitimate son named Joseph Davis. And then he also went by this Menominee Indian name. And so I'll let you draw your own conclusions, but I was telling Tom, it's been interesting because I've looked on different sites on the internet where I found different theses and dissertations where academics have talked about this when they have been talking about the relationship between the Menominee Indians in that part of Wisconsin and the American Army. And so just something interesting that some of you might want to further research. I thought it was pretty interesting. Well, anyway, so as I say, he ended up marrying this woman to whom he was engaged at the time that they had his funeral back in Racine. And so he ends up having a very full life. He serves one term as governor of Wisconsin in the 1890s. Wanted to get out of politics after that. He said, I don't want anything to do with all these nefarious people anymore. And he said one term was enough. And he said, I'm ready now to go back into private life, which he did. Well, he and his wife had a very wonderful relationship, a long marriage of about 45, 46 years. She died in 1912. And in his grief, he decided that he would leave Wisconsin for a while and that he would buy a boat and sail down the Atlantic coast, which he did. He bought a boat in Philadelphia, then sailed a yacht down the Atlantic coast. He did this during the fall of the year, and he got into a terrible storm around Cape Hatteras. He was just outside of Beaufort, North Carolina, and probably was a hurricane this time of year. And so he ended up being stranded in Beaufort for a couple of weeks. Well, by this time, by 1912, some of the newspapers around the country are starting to have photographs in it. Well, one day, there's a photograph of this 71-year-old Governor Upham, which appears in the Beaufort, North Carolina daily newspaper. And this well-to-do couple in town, by the name of Dr. and Mrs. Duncan, are reading the paper one morning. Dr. Duncan has one piece of it, his wife has another. Dr. Duncan turns to his wife and says, Clyde said, did you read about this former Wisconsin governor who's stranded here in Beaufort? And she said, I sure did, Doc. Said, are you thinking what I'm thinking? And he said, and what might that be? He said, my sister Grace, who's 28 years old, has been living upstairs with us for far too long. It's time that she got married. So they sent word over to the hotel where he was staying for him to come over for dinner. A romance did ensue. 2 years later, Governor Upham and Miss Grace Mason married. He was 73, and at the time then she was 28. And what's interesting about that, I saw the headlines in the Marshfield newspaper when it became word in 1914, when it was divulged that they were going to get married. That did look like something from the National Enquirer. It had these huge headlines that said, secret out, Governor Upham to wed woman, 28. And so they married. 2 years after that, in 1916, Will was born when his dad was 75. And then 5 years after that, when his dad was 80, Will fathered his second son, who was Fritz. And that is whom we are going to hear in the National Geographic video. So if we could go ahead, Lynn, if we can show that video, and mention if we can just look up Children of Civil War Veterans Still Walk Among Us. This is about a 6-minute video presentation, folks. They're going to be interviewing two people, one of whom will be the daughter of a Confederate veteran. Then they will switch to Governor Upham's son, Fritz. Then they'll go back to the Confederate daughter, then to the Union son. And I think you'll like it. They complement each other very, very nicely. And so we'll go ahead and we'll see that in just a moment. This was produced a couple of years ago, as I say, by National Geographic. Fritz, whom you are going to hear, unfortunately passed away just a few months ago. And he almost reached his 98th birthday. Just a terrific ambassador for American history. Folks, I don't want you to have any misconceptions about the content of the book. So as we're closing, I wanted to elucidate something for you. About 25–30% of the book pertains to the children's reflections of their dad's Civil War lives. And then about 70% would be their retrospections of growing up during the Depression and fighting in World War II. So it's not really a Civil War book. It's much more a book of Americana. The scope is much larger. There are 8 chapters of the book, each devoted to a different Civil War vet and his family. This first chapter is representative of what the content would be like in the other chapters. In this case, and I mentioned this family a little bit earlier, this Civil War vet from Arkansas, and all 8 of the families are Union families. 2 of the families, though, are Southern, 5 are Midwestern, and 1 is a New York City family. As you know, there were a lot of Southerners, a lot of sections of the South that remained loyal to the Union. And so that wasn't unusual at all that we found a couple gentlemen who were Southerners who made the book. In this case, the Arkansas man was 71 when he remarried. It was his 3rd marriage. It was his wife's 2nd. She was 27. He sired these 5 children after 71. And 4 of them were living when we conducted the interviews. So at the end of the 4 years, because it took 4 years to complete the book, I took the interviews and combined them so that they read like a conversation, just like these 4 elderly folks were sitting at your kitchen table, reflecting on their dad's life, recalling stories that he told them about the Civil War, things that the children did with him during their teenage years and younger. And then in his case, for that Civil War vet, all 3 of his sons, whom we interviewed, ended up fighting in World War II. So their Depression-era World War II narratives come at the end of the chapter. And those are not combined. Those are kept separately. Because as I mentioned, obviously there was a lot more content to be gleaned from these folks about their own war experiences as opposed to their dad's Civil War lives. So probably 75% of the book, the content, the Civil War children's retrospections of growing up during the Depression and fighting in World War II. Lynn, thank you again for all of your engineering that you did for us this afternoon. Tom, I am very, very appreciative. This was a great honor to have the opportunity to come to one of the presidential libraries, and I just was elated to be able to do it. And I wish our crowd had been a little bit bigger, but I love being able to see the interaction you folks had in this, and I hope it wasn't too boring. And in case you're interested in purchasing a copy of the book, they're $22, and I'd be glad to sign one for you outside afterwards in case anyone is interested. So at this point, Tom, I will turn it over back to you.